There is a kind of silence that only exists inside a palace at the moment everything ends. Not quiet, not peace, something colder. The silence of torches extinguished, of guards who have been given new orders, of a kingdom holding its breath while the wrong man climbs the wrong throne. Lady Imseojin heard that silence on the last night of her life. She was 31 years old, daughter of the great northern general, Im Daehyun, wife of the second prince, Lee Hyun, mother of no one. They had taken that from her in the second year of the marriage. The fever that came and went and left her arms permanently, devastatingly empty. She was standing in the corridor outside the queen's private chambers with blood on her hem and a letter in her hand that she should have burned 3 months ago. The letter was in the third prince's handwriting. She had found it in her husband's study, and she had held it, and she had read it, and she had stood very still for a very long time while the entirety of her life rearranged itself into a shape she didn't recognize. The third prince, Lee Jun, the man with the poet's face and the statesman's mind and the particular cruelty of someone who had decided, very early in his life, that he deserved more than he had been given, and had the patience to take it slowly, carefully, in pieces so small no one noticed until the whole was already gone. The letter was an instruction. The king dies tonight. Ensure the queen does not send word to the northern army. The second prince must not reach his father in time. When it is done, everything we promised. Asterisk. Her husband's name was not on the letter. His seal was. Seojin had been the daughter of a general. She knew what a seal meant. She knew what her husband had done. She stood in the corridor with the letter, and the palace fell quiet around her, and she understood that she had approximately 1 hour before the third prince's men came for the witnesses. She ran. Not for herself. She had, somewhere in the space of reading that letter and reaching the corridor, stopped thinking about herself. She ran for the one person in this palace she had never managed to stop loving, even when loving him was the most dangerous possible thing. The sixth prince, Lee Min-soo, scholar, dreamer, the youngest of the princes, 24 years old and constitutionally unsuited for palace survival in every way. Too honest, too kind, too much the sort of man who stopped to help injured birds and forgot to watch his back. She had loved him first, before her father had chosen safety over her heart and married her to the second prince. Before 5 years of a marriage that was functional and cold and occasionally, in the dark, unbearably lonely. Before she had learned, the way you learn things in palaces, to fold her love into something smaller so it would fit inside a space that couldn't hold it. She reached the sixth prince's residence at a run. She was 10 steps from the door when the third prince's guards stepped out of the shadows. There were 6 of them. She stopped. One of them held a torch. The others held swords. The one in the center, the captain, she recognized him. A man who had once bowed to her in a corridor and smiled, said, "Lady Im, the third prince sends his regards." She looked at the letter in her hand. She looked at the door behind them, the door she had not reached, the door behind which Lee Min-soo was sleeping or reading or existing in the peaceful, oblivious way of a man who did not yet know that tonight was the end of everything. She made a decision. She turned and ran the other direction. Not because she thought she could escape, because if they chased her, they weren't watching his door. She made it 40 steps before they caught her. The corridor was cold and dark, and the last thing she felt was the stone floor against her cheek, and the last thing she saw was the flame of a torch reflecting in a puddle of rainwater. Orange and wavering and very beautiful. And then nothing. She died. The second prince survived the night. He had not known what his seal was used for, or so the third prince's version of events would later claim, and the third prince was now in a position to decide whose version of events was true. The king died before dawn. The queen's message to the northern army arrived 3 days late. Intercepted, delayed, the messenger found in a river outside the capital. The third prince was crowned within the month. The sixth prince, Lee Min-soo, was sentenced to exile in the northern territories. Not executed. The new king was merciful, people said. How generous. How benevolent. No one who knew the new king believed the mercy was mercy. Exile in the north, in winter, without proper resources, it was execution on a delayed schedule with deniability. Lee Min-soo died of cold and fever 40 days into his exile. He was 24 years old. The Northern Army never came. The kingdom survived. It simply became something else. She woke to the smell of pine wood and fresh ink. For a moment she lay perfectly still, cataloging warmth, softness, the particular weight of heavy silk blankets, the distant sound of women's voices, a bird outside a window, morning light behind her eyelids, pale and winter-thin. I'm dead, she thought. Or I should be. She opened her eyes. The ceiling above her was carved cedarwood, painted with cranes. She knew this ceiling. She had stared at it on many restless nights when sleep would not come and the marriage bed beside her was cold and correct and nothing else. She turned her head. She was in her own chambers. Her original chambers, the ones she had occupied before the marriage, before the second prince, before everything. The guest wing of her father's estate. She sat up. Her hands. She looked at her hands. Young. Unmarked. The calluses from archery practice she had lost after 3 years of palace life were back on her palm. The jade ring she had worn as the second prince's wife was gone. There was ink on her right forefinger. The ink mark she'd had at 17, from practicing calligraphy every morning before her father's morning briefings. Her heart began to beat very fast. My lady. A handmaiden appeared in the doorway, young, familiar, a girl named Boksoon who had served her at 17 and then been reassigned when she married. Boksoon looked exactly as she had at 17. Your father requests your presence at breakfast. The military envoy from the capital has arrived early. Seojin stared at her. Which military envoy? She said. Her voice came out strange, steadier than she expected. What is his business? Boksoon blinked. The crown's envoy, my lady. To discuss the betrothal proposals. The betrothal proposals. She pressed her hands flat against her thighs. There had been 3 betrothal proposals in her 17th year. The second prince, presented through official channels by the court with all the weight of political alliance. The sixth prince, presented informally by a mutual family friend. A casual suggestion, almost apologetic, as if everyone involved understood it was not the strategically correct choice. And a third proposal from a northern border lord her father had dismissed in under a day. She had chosen the second prince. No, her father had chosen the second prince, and she had not fought hard enough against it. Had told herself it was duty. Had told herself a general's daughter understood sacrifice. Had told herself the sixth prince was sweet but unprepared for the weight of her family's political position. Had told herself, late at night and less convincingly each time, it's the right choice. She was 17 years old again. The betrayal had not happened. The king was alive. The third prince was... She closed her eyes and calculated. The third prince was still building his network, still operating with the patient underground precision that had taken her 13 years to understand. He was 4 years away from being ready to move. She had 4 years. She pressed her hands flat against her thighs until they steadied. One thing at a time, she thought. Asterisk the envoy first. Father second. Then everything. Asterisk. She rose. She dressed. She went to breakfast. The military envoy was a man named Captain Ryu, gray-bearded and formal, carrying the court's proposal in a lacquered box with a red seal. He presented it at the breakfast table with all the appropriate ceremony while her father sat at the head of the table reading the document with the expression he wore when reviewing troop positions. Assessing, unsentimental, looking for weaknesses. Seojin sat 2 seats down with her hands in her lap and watched her father read the document that had determined the shape of her entire life. Asterisk second Prince Lee Hyun, third in the line of succession, distinguished military record, the document read. Strong alliance potential with the Northern Army. Mutual benefit to both houses. Asterisk. She remembered this moment. She had sat in this exact chair with her hands in her exact lap and felt, underneath the appropriate dutiful stillness, a very small, very quiet heartbreak. The kind you pack away quickly before anyone sees it. It is a strong proposal, her father said. Yes, father, she said. This was the moment. She knew what she had said next the first time. She had said, I will accept whatever you decide. And she had meant it and not meant it simultaneously, the way only 17-year-olds can mean and not mean something in the exact same breath. There is also, her father said, setting down the document. The matter of the sixth prince's inquiry. He said it the way he said things he had already dismissed, informative, not deliberate. An item on a list being read aloud. Yes, she said. He is a scholar, her father said. No military appointment. No formal court position. His mother was a court lady of moderate rank. He would have no standing to support a general's daughter adequately. I understand, she said. The second prince's proposal is clearly the stronger alignment. She looked at her father. General Imdahyun was not a cold man. He was a man who had spent 40 years making decisions that affected thousands of lives, and the way you survived doing that, the way you kept yourself functional, was to become very good at setting aside what you wanted in favor of what worked. He had applied that skill to everything, including his daughter. She had understood that, the first time, only in retrospect. Father, she said, if the sixth prince were to receive a court appointment, a formal scholarly position, something that gave him standing, would you reconsider the comparison? He looked up at her. A real look, not the dismissive one. That is a hypothetical, he said. Hypothetically, she said. A pause. The captain shifted uncomfortably in the background. This was not how these meetings were supposed to go. Her father set the court document down. Why? He said, in the particular tone that meant he was genuinely asking. She thought about everything she could not say. About a marriage bed that was cold and correct. About a letter in a husband's study. About a corridor at the end of everything, and a door she had not reached and 40 steps. Because I think strength can take different forms, she said. And I think I am my father's daughter enough to recognize it in unfamiliar shapes. Her father looked at her for a long moment. He was not a man who showed surprise. But something moved through his expression. A fractional adjustment. The look of a man who has heard something he did not expect and is deciding how to respond to it. I will consider the matter further, he said. Captain Ryu looked as if he might protest, and thought better of it. Seojin lowered her head in the appropriate respectful gesture and said nothing else. Underneath the table, her hands were shaking. She saw him at court 3 weeks later. Her father had brought her to the capital for the King's Autumn Festival. The first time she had attended as a young woman of marriageable age rather than a general's dependent daughter. She wore deep green silk and her mother's jade earrings, and she moved through the court functions with the particular careful awareness of someone who knows exactly how much danger is dressed as celebration. The third prince found her in the Eastern Garden during the afternoon recess. Not by accident. Lee Jun was 27 years old and already the most politically accomplished person in any room he entered. He was also, and this was the difficulty, genuinely charismatic. The charm was real. The intelligence was real. Even the warmth he showed in individual conversation was real, in the sense that he was truly interested in the people he was cultivating. He was just also planning to kill the king. Lady Im, he said, approaching with the easy grace of a man who moved through spaces as if they had been arranged for him. I don't believe we have been properly introduced. I'm told your father's northern army is the finest military force in the kingdom. You flatter them, she said. I never flatter, he said. It's imprecise. I state assessments. He fell into step beside her along the garden path, the casual presumption of a man who had decided the conversation was happening. I've heard your father is reviewing betrothal proposals. That is a family matter. Of course. A smile. The kind that reached his eyes. I only mention it because I have certain perspectives on the various proposals in circulation. If they would be useful. She looked at him. In her first life, she had never spoken to the third prince. He had been above her social reach as the second prince's wife, not dangerous to her directly, merely present at court functions, always pleasant, always slightly magnetic. She had not understood, until the letter, that she had been living inside his design without knowing the design existed. Now she looked at him and saw the design from the inside. I appreciate your highness's concern, she said. I'm certain my father is thorough in his considerations. Your father is an excellent general, the third prince said. He thinks like a military man, efficiently, alliance value, strategic position, lines of succession. He paused. He may not fully account for the human element. The human element, she repeated. The second prince, he said very casually, is a man of considerable ambition, which is a quality one values in a political ally and sometimes finds difficult in a husband. He glanced at her sidelong, just briefly, just long enough for the observation to land. I say this as someone who has known him all his life. She held his gaze. You are trying to steer me, she thought. Even now. Even this early. You want my father's army, and you know marrying me to the second prince creates a loyalty chain you can't control. So you are here in this garden planting a seed. That is very candid of you, she said. I find candor efficient, he said. He smiled again. Genuine, warm. The smile of a man who was telling partial truths and knew she couldn't tell which parts were partial. I hope your family makes the choice that serves you best, Lady Im. He inclined his head and moved away. She stood in the garden and watched him go. Then she turned and went to find the sixth prince. Lee Min-soo was, as she had expected, not at the political functions. She found him in the palace library. He was seated at a long table covered in scrolls, his outer robe slightly askew, ink on 2 fingers and a distracted furrow between his brows. He was 21 years old in this timeline, younger than she remembered, the laughter lines not yet established around his eyes, the silver not yet at his temples. She stood in the doorway for a moment before he noticed her. He looked up, then he looked back down at his scroll. Then he looked up again more slowly. Lady Im, he said, careful, appropriate. I'm not angry, she said, and she wasn't, not anymore. She had lived the consequences of this decision and she understood, now, that her father had not been wrong in his logic. He had simply been working with incomplete information. He had not known about the third prince. He had not known what the second prince's seal would be used for. He had not known that the northern army would be asked to save a kingdom and arrive too late. He had not known. I want to ask you something, she said. Ask. The third prince, she said. What do you know of him? Her father's expression shifted, alert, military, the look of a man receiving intelligence. Lee Jun. Why? He spoke to me at the festival. He was very personable. He is always personable. What is your assessment of him? Honestly. Her father was quiet for a moment. He had, she knew, a general's instincts, the ability to read terrain and threat at a level that went below conscious thought. He was also, in certain specific areas, willfully blind. The court was one of them. He is talented, her father said carefully. Politically adept. He has built an impressive network of allies for his age. Do you trust him? A pause. Longer than the last one. I trust him the way I trust any gifted tactician who has not yet shown me his true objective, her father said. She looked at her father's face, the face she had grown up reading, the face that gave away nothing and still, somehow, gave her everything she needed. Then watch him, father, she said. Please, whatever happens, watch him. Her father studied her for a long moment. Is there something you're not telling me? He said. There is always something I'm not telling you, she said. You taught me that information has value only when released correctly. Despite everything, something shifted at the corner of his mouth. I taught you too well, he said. She bowed and left. She went to her chambers and sat with her hands in her lap and thought about 4 years. About how to move carefully inside a life she had already lived. About the second prince, whom she would have to marry, or find a way not to marry. And about the third prince, who was already building the structure that would bring the palace down. About Lee Min-soo, alone in a library with his flood drainage proposal and ink on his fingers. She pressed her hands flat against her thighs. One thing at a time. She met her betrothed formally at the winter court. Prince Lee Hyun was... She had forgotten how to see him without the weight of everything that came after. He was 30 years old in this timeline. Dark, controlled, the face of a man who wore authority easily because he had never questioned his right to it. Not cruel. Not immediately threatening. The kind of man who was very pleasant to be around until you understood that his pleasantness was a resource he managed strategically. He was also, which she had not fully registered the first time, watching her with a very specific quality of attention. Not the open curiosity of the sixth prince. Not the calculated assessment of the third prince. Something more possessive. More proprietary. This is his alliance, she thought, standing across from him at the formal introduction ceremony while the court watched and approved. He thinks of it as his. The Northern Army. My father's position. Me. Lady M. He inclined his head. I've heard much of your father's household. Your Highness honors us, she said. I hope we will come to know each other better, he said. Before the wedding, I would welcome the opportunity, she said. Across the room, the third prince was standing with a cup of wine and a pleasant expression, and he was looking at her and the second prince with the particular look of a man watching pieces move into position. She held the third prince's gaze for exactly 1 second, just long enough to let him see that she saw. His expression didn't change, but he raised his cup very slightly in something that might, from a distance, look like a toast. Beside her, the second prince said, My brother makes you uncomfortable. She looked at him. He was watching her face, perceptive, which she had underestimated the first time. He is very charming, she said carefully. He is, the second prince said. He is also very interested in your father's army. He let that sit for a moment. Not in the way that leads to betrothal proposals. In the way that involves long conversations with generals about supply routes and deployment patterns. She looked at the second prince. He was telling her something. Consciously, deliberately, in the first official meeting of their betrothal. He was telling her that he had noticed his brother and that he was not comfortable with what he had noticed. This was different from her first life. In her first life, the second prince had used his seal on that letter. In her first life, she had found it and run and died in a corridor with 40 steps to go. But what if she had read that letter wrong? What if the seal had been taken, used without his knowledge? What if the second prince had not been a collaborator but a target? She looked at the man who was going to be her husband and felt the ground shift slightly beneath her understanding. That is useful to know, she said. He looked at her. You're not what I expected, he said. I'm told I rarely am, she said. His mouth shifted. Not quite a smile, but something that could become one. I think, he said, that this arrangement may be more interesting than I anticipated. The wedding was set for spring. In the months between, Seojin did 3 things. The first, she began a careful, systematic documentation of everything she knew about the third prince's network. Not from observation, because she was 17 and had no independent means of investigation, but from memory. Names, dates, the structure of alliances as she had eventually reconstructed it. She wrote these in code on the backs of calligraphy practice sheets and kept them under a loose floorboard in her chambers. The second, she sent a letter to Lee Min-soo. Not romantic. Not anything that could be used against either of them. She wrote as a reader who had found an article on Southern flood management and wanted to discuss it with the author, whose name a mutual scholar friend had mentioned. She signed it with her courtesy title, not her family name. He wrote back within the week. The correspondence that developed over 3 months was everything she had not allowed herself in her first life. Sharp, engaged, genuine. He argued with her positions and she argued back, and neither of them yielded to politeness when they thought the other was wrong. He told her about a drainage project he had finally gotten the Ministry of Works to agree to review. She told him carefully about the supply route vulnerabilities her father had mentioned, and watched him connect them to his flood projections with a speed that surprised even her. He never signed his letters with his title. He signed them M. She kept every one. The third thing, she went to her father. Not once. Many times. In the weeks before the wedding, she brought him, carefully and in pieces, everything she could credibly present as a 17-year-old general's daughter with sharp ears and a family background in military intelligence. She framed it always as questions. Father, I overheard something at court. Is this normal? Father, doesn't it seem unusual that the third prince's personal guard rotation aligns with the king's private schedule? Father, is there a reason the border garrison reports haven't been filed through the normal ministry channels? Her father was a general. He knew how to receive intelligence. He began watching. He said nothing specific to her. But she noticed the changes. A private audience with the king that he had not sought before. A quiet reassignment of 2 men in his northern army to court duty. A new channel of communication with the crown prince's personal advisor that had not existed 6 months ago. It was not enough. She knew it wasn't enough. But it was more than the first time. The morning of the wedding, a letter arrived from M. She had not expected one. She had said nothing in her last letter to suggest she was nervous or that she needed anything. But the letter arrived in the first light, delivered by an anonymous runner, and she opened it with hands that were steadier than she felt. It was short. I am told that administrative positions can be valuable to the work of scholars who want to see their ideas implemented, rather than merely proposed. A friend has suggested I pursue a formal appointment within the Ministry of Works. I will be in the capital for the foreseeable future, which means the correspondence need not be so slow. Congratulations on your marriage, Lady M. I hope it brings you what you were looking for. M. She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and pressed it into the hidden pocket she had sewn into her bridal robe. She thought about 40 steps and an empty corridor and a door she hadn't reached. This time, she thought. This time I will have more than 40 steps. 2 years passed. The marriage was exactly as it had been and different in every detail that mattered. The second prince was not cruel. He was not warm. He was a man who had entered the marriage expecting a political resource and found, instead, a woman who had opinions about military logistics, read 3 newspapers a day, and had a correspondence with the Ministry of Work's newest administrative scholar that she maintained with a consistency he could not help but notice. He noticed. He was perceptive. She had learned that at the winter court, and she had underestimated how much that perception would be directed at her. "The scholar," he said one evening over their supper table. "The one you write to about flood management." She set down her chopsticks. "The 6th prince," he said. She held his gaze. "We write about infrastructure," she said. "I grew up in a general's household. Supply routes and drainage management are not frivolous interests." "I know they're not." He was not angry. He was assessing. "I'm not prohibiting the correspondence. I'm noting that you are a perceptive woman, and I'd like to know what you see when you look at my youngest brother." She thought about how to answer. "A good man," she said finally. "Poorly positioned." "Yes." He set his own chopsticks down. "And is a good man, poorly positioned, something you find interesting?" The question hung between them in the cold space above the supper table. She had never, in her first life, had a real conversation with her husband. She had been too far inside her own loneliness. He had been too far inside his own. They had existed in the same household for 5 years and never actually spoken. "I married you," she said. "Whatever I find interesting is confined by that." He was quiet. "That is either a very loyal answer," he said, "or a very careful one. Can't it be both?" Something shifted in his face. Not the proprietary assessment. Something more genuine. Something that might, given time and very different circumstances, have become something else. "My brother," he said, meaning the 3rd prince. "What do you see when you look at him?" She held his gaze. "Something that worries me." "What specifically?" This was the moment. She had been waiting for it. The moment when the man her father had chosen for her revealed whether he was someone she could work with, or whether she was alone. She told him. Not everything. Not the letter. Not what she had found in his study in her first life. She had no way to explain how she knew about that letter without explaining things that could not be explained. But she told him what she had observed and what she suspected and what she had spent 2 years carefully feeding to her father through the channel of a well-positioned general's daughter with sharp ears. She watched the 2nd prince listen. He was very still. When she finished, he said, "How long have you known?" "I began suspecting before our wedding," she said. "And you said nothing to me." "I didn't know you," she said. "I didn't know which side of this you were on." The silence that followed was very long. "I'm on the king's side," he said finally. "Whatever that's worth." "It's worth something," she said, "if we act quickly enough." He looked at her across the cold supper table. "You have a plan," he said. I have the beginning of one, she said. He picked up his chopsticks. Tell me, he said. She had calculated 4 years. She got 3. The third prince moved in autumn of the 3rd year, a year earlier than he had in her first life, which meant something had changed, which meant he had noticed something. She found out at midnight, through a runner sent by her father's court representative, a message in military code. Asterisk eagle flies early. Nest endangered. Asterisk. The king. She was out of bed in under a minute. She woke her husband. He was already awake. He was standing at his study desk with papers in his hand and the expression of a man who has just received confirmation of his worst suspicion. He looked at her in the doorway and said, "You knew." "I knew it was coming," she said. "Not tonight." "My father is still alive," she said, with more certainty than she had. The runner used past tense if the subject is already gone. He didn't. "We have time." "Not much." She crossed to the desk. "Your loyal guard, how many?" 40 in the compound. Another 60 I can reach before dawn. "The 6th prince needs to be moved," she said. He looked at her. "Min-Su," she said. "He is your brother's first target. Removing him from the equation removes the most legitimate alternative claimant. If the 3rd prince gets to him tonight, you know my brother's tactical priorities. I've studied him for 3 years," she said, which was not entirely the truth and was more than she had ever admitted out loud. A pause. "Go," he said. "Take 4 of my men. I'll manage the compound and get word to the King's Guard. And the Northern Army. Your father has already been contacted," he said, "through the channel you helped build. The message went 2 hours ago." She stopped. "You knew it was coming tonight," she said. "I suspected," he said. "I had one of my men watching the 3rd prince's personal guard movements. When 3 of his best disappeared from their posts at nightfall." He met her eyes. "I had hoped to tell you in the morning. I thought," he stopped. "You thought you had more time," she said. "Yes." The candle on his desk guttered in a draft. "My guard is in the front hall," he said. "Be careful." She was already moving toward the door. "Seo-jin." She turned. He was standing behind his desk with the papers in his hand and the expression of a man who is deciding something quickly. "Whatever happens tonight, we should have talked sooner. It was not much. For a cold marriage in a cold palace in the middle of a coup, it was not much." "Yes," she said. "We should have." She left. She ran. Not for herself. She had learned from dying that running for yourself was not as fast. She had 4 guards at her heels and a torch in her hand and the palace corridors mapped in her memory from a lifetime of knowing them. The servants' passages, the back routes, the way the eastern wing connected to the residential quarter through a supply corridor that most people forgot existed. She was not 40 steps away. She was there. She came through the supply corridor door into the outer room of Lee Min-Su's residence before the 3rd prince's men reached the building. She estimated, approximately 3 minutes. She sent 2 guards to the outer door with instructions. "Hold it, whatever it costs, for 3 minutes." She sent the other 2 inside to wake the household. She went directly to the inner chamber. Lee Min-Su was awake. He was sitting on the edge of his bed with a candle lit and a book in his hand. Not sleeping, she realized. Reading at midnight the way he apparently did when something was keeping him up. He looked up when she came through the door, and his expression moved through several things very rapidly. Surprise, recognition, confusion, and then, as his eyes took in the guard at her back, the torch, the absolute lack of ceremony. Something more alert. "What's happening?" he said. Not a question. "Your brother is making his move tonight," she said. "The king may already be under attack. We need to get you out of this residence." He set the book down. He stood. He did not ask why she was here instead of a palace guard. He did not ask how she knew. He reached for his outer robe. "Where?" he said. "My father's city house," she said. "It's defensible, it's outside the palace proper. And it has a signal tower." He nodded. From the outer room, the sound of fighting. They moved. Through the supply corridor, she led, torch in hand, the way she had run once before in the other direction, and out through the back gate into the city streets, where the air was cold and the stars were out and the palace behind them was beginning distantly to light up with the wrong kind of torches. They ran. She was aware of him beside her. His breathing, his hand once on her arm when she stumbled, the way he kept pace with her rather than pulling ahead. Small things. The kind of things you notice when you are running through the dark beside someone you have been carefully, precisely, deciding not to love for 3 years. They reached her father's city house as the first alarm bells began sounding from the palace. She got him inside. She sent word to the signal tower. She sat down on a low bench in the receiving hall with her torch guttering and her hands pressed flat against her thighs. Lee Min-soo sat across from her. "You knew this was coming," he said. "Yes." "How long?" She looked at him, at the face she had carried in her memory into death and back out the other side. He was 24 years old. Exactly the age he had been when he died in the north of cold and fever, 40 days into an exile that had been designed to be a death sentence. He was alive. He was here, in her father's house, with ink on his fingers and a look in his eyes that she did not know how to categorize. "Long enough," she said. "Your husband," he said. "Does he?" "He's managing the compound," she said. "He's known for months. We've been working toward this together." A pause. "Together?" Lee Min-soo repeated. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her the way he had looked at her across the library table, the way he had been looking at her in corridors and across rooms for 3 years, when he thought she wasn't watching. "Lady Im," he said. "All the letters were about flood management," she said, firmly. "Yes," he said. "They were." A pause. "They were also more than that." She looked at him. Outside, the alarm bells. Inside, the careful, impossible silence of 2 people in a room where everything has finally been said that can be said, and everything that cannot be said is sitting between them like a third presence. "We have to survive tonight first," she said. "Yes," he said. "And then there is." She stopped. "There is a great deal to be determined." "Yes," he said again. He didn't look away. She didn't either. The third prince was captured before dawn. Not because she had planned it perfectly. Not because her information was complete or her timing was precise or her network was strong enough. Because the Northern Army arrived. They arrived 6 hours earlier than they had in her first life. 6 hours that represented 3 years of careful channel building, of feeding her father intelligence through the acceptable voice of a general's observant daughter, of placing 2 men in court duty positions where they could watch and report. 6 hours that represented every conversation she had steered, every question she had asked, every piece of the timeline she had tried to alter with the tools available to a 17-year-old girl in a world that did not give 17-year-old girls tools. The third prince's men were good. They were not good enough for 600 northern soldiers and a palace guard that had been warned. The third prince was taken in the throne room at the 2nd hour of morning, still holding a document he had not yet had time to have the king sign. The king was alive. Wounded, shaken, furious, but alive. The second prince stood in the throne room with blood on his armor and the expression of a man who had just spent 8 hours choosing a side very decisively. Seojin stood beside him. They had agreed, in the frantic hours of that night, on a version of events that protected what needed to be protected. Her foreknowledge was explained as careful intelligence gathering. Her correspondence with the sixth prince was described as infrastructure scholarship. Her father's preparation was attributed to the general's instincts her father genuinely had. The story was mostly true. Only the beginning was impossible to explain. She stood in the throne room with her hands folded and her hem slightly muddy from a night of running, and she watched the third prince be taken from the room in chains, and she felt, not triumph, not vindication, something quieter, the specific, exhausted relief of a woman who has been holding her breath for a very long time and has finally been allowed to breathe. The king spoke. Orders were given. The court began to move in the controlled frenzy of aftermath. Ministers clustered. Decisions were made. Her husband turned to her. "The sixth prince," he said quietly, for her ears only. "In my father's house," she said. "Safe." He nodded. He looked at her with the expression she had watched develop over 3 years, the one that was not warmth and was not assessment and was something in between that she still did not entirely know how to read. "What you did tonight," he said, What you did for 3 years, he stopped. I owe you more than I know how to say. You believed me when it mattered, she said. That was what I needed. He held her gaze. We have been, he said, a poor substitute for what each of us might have wanted. She did not answer. I think, he said, that we owe each other an honest conversation about what we want, going forward. He glanced toward the door. She understood the direction of his glance. All of us. Something compressed in her chest. That is a complicated conversation, she said. Yes, he said. I know. He moved away to speak with a minister. She stood in the throne room and breathed. The honest conversation happened 3 days later. She did not plan it. She did not arrange it. It happened in the garden of her father's city house, which was where Lee Min-soo was still staying while the palace was secured, where she had come to bring him news of the trial proceedings, and where she had found him at the window of the receiving room watching the winter garden and looking like a man who had been doing a great deal of thinking. He's going to offer me a formal position, he said when she came in. Not hello. He had been waiting for her. She could see it in the way he turned from the window, the way he'd been standing before the turn. The second prince. He came here this morning. I know, she said. A court appointment. Ministry of Works. Full formal standing. He looked at her. It's everything I've been trying to build for 2 years. It's exactly the right position. He presented it perfectly. Yes, she said. He is perceptive. He also, Lee Min-soo said carefully, told me that the marriage arrangement, the terms of it, were going to be reviewed, given the circumstances. She was very still. Did he? She said. He said that the alliance for which it was contracted had been secured through other means, and that he believed, and I'm quoting this precisely because I want to be accurate, that you deserve a choice. The winter garden outside was bare and brown, the last leaves gone. Cold light through the latticed windows. The ink mark still on his right forefinger. She noticed, always noticed. That was generous of him, she said. It was, Lee Min-soo agreed. He is not a generous man by nature, I think. But he was being deliberate. A pause. He is also being, what is the word, strategic. I think he has his eye on someone else. I think that's been true for some time. She didn't ask who. She didn't need to. So, he said. Here we are. Here we are, she agreed. He crossed the room. He stopped 2 feet from her, respecting the distances of 3 years, all the correspondence and the careful library conversation and the running through dark streets with her torch and his hand on her arm. And he looked at her with the look she had been carrying in her memory since before she knew it was a memory. The letters, he said, were about flood management, she said. Jean. It was the first time, the absolute first time in this life in 3 years that he had used her personal name. It moved through her like something coming back, like a door finally opening. Yes, she said. I have been in love with you, he said. Since you walked into the Royal Library and argued with me about drainage infrastructure for an hour, and I have spent 3 years being extremely careful about it. He paused. I would like to stop being careful about it. She looked at him. She thought about a girl at 17 sitting at a breakfast table while her father read a document that determined her life, and the very small, very quiet heartbreak she had packed away. She thought about letters signed M. And the specific quality of an argument with someone who didn't yield to politeness. She thought about 40 steps and a corridor and a door she had not reached. She had reached the door this time. She was standing in front of it. I have, she said slowly, made a great many mistakes in the choices of my life. I have chosen duty over what I wanted, and then doubted the choice, and then been unable to undo it. Yes, he said. I don't want to be careful anymore either, she said. Something in his face, something that had been held very carefully for a very long time, let go. He reached out and took her hand. Not dramatic, not the passionate, desperate gesture of people who have been waiting too long. Just a hand taking her hand. The way you take hold of something you intend to keep. Outside, the winter garden. Inside, the particular silence of 2 people who have finally said the true thing. The drainage proposal, she said after a moment. He laughed. An actual, unguarded laugh. The one she had been exchanging letters with for 3 years. What about it? I want to read the final version, she said, before it goes to the ministry. I'll send it by morning, he said. She turned her hand over in his. The light through the lattice was thin and winter-pale, but it was there. The third prince was tried in the 3rd month and exiled to an island in the southern sea. Not executed, which was the king's mercy, and not released, which was the king's wisdom. His network was dismantled carefully over months, with the systematic precision of a general who had been given 3 years of intelligence and finally the authority to act on it. The second prince remarried the following year. A minister's daughter, quiet, practical, with a gift for political negotiation that complemented him in ways that Jean, watching from a careful distance, thought were probably better for both of them. She wished him, with something approaching sincerity, the life he should have had. The Northern Army maintained its independence. The flood drainage project was approved. She married Lee Min-soo in the 1st month of spring. There was no grand ceremony. They were not young royals making a political statement. They were a retired second prince's wife and a Ministry of Works scholar and a general's daughter, and the wedding was attended by family and close court friends and her father's aide-de-camp who wept for reasons he could not fully articulate. She wore green, not bridal crimson. She had worn bridal crimson once, and it had been the wrong color for who she actually was. After the ceremony, they walked in the garden that was just beginning to come back. The first shoots, the tentative green, the determined optimism of things that had survived winter and intended to grow. He was talking about the drainage project. He was always talking about the drainage project. It had expanded now to include 3 southern provinces and a pilot program in the northern supply counties, and he had opinions about all of it. She was listening, really listening, the way she had learned to listen in letters, the way she had never been taught to listen in her first life, when she was too busy being careful about all the wrong things. She thought about a girl on a cold floor in a dead woman's body, pressing her hands flat against her thighs and thinking. One thing at a time. She had taken it one thing at a time. She had been too slow in some places, too cautious in others. She had made new mistakes, different ones, which was perhaps the best you could hope for. She had not saved everyone she had wanted to save. She had not fixed everything. But the king was alive. The third prince was gone. Her father's army stood between the kingdom and its worst instincts. And the man beside her was talking about drainage. She slipped her hand into his. He stopped mid-sentence. He looked at her. He smiled, the specific, uncomplicated smile of a man who has spent 3 years being careful and has finally been given permission not to be. The Southern Pilot Program, she said. You were saying. Right, he said. Right. So the third county's soil composition is. The spring came in around them, persistent and unhurried. The way springs came. Not all at once, but in pieces small and accumulating, until one day you looked up and the world was green. She had gotten it wrong once. She had tried again. That, she thought, that was enough. She would never know exactly what had sent her back. Some nights she still felt the cold corridor floor against her cheek and woke with her hands reaching for something she couldn't name. Some mornings she stood at the window and felt the weight of the life she hadn't lived pressing against the one she had. She didn't talk about it. There were no words for it that anyone would understand. But sometimes, when Min-soo fell asleep over his work papers and she sat across from him in the lamplight, reading the draft of whatever proposal he was working on and annotating it in the margins because she couldn't help herself, sometimes she thought, this is what I was running toward in that corridor. Not 40 steps. This end.